Good evening. Or should I say late? It's late afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming here today. I'm Steve Ross, and I am the Myron and Marian Kasdan Director of the USC Kasdan Institute for the Study of the Jewish Role in American Life. And I also double as a professor of history here at USC. And on behalf of the Kasdan Institute, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 12th Annual Burton B. Lewis Lecture. And this is one of a series of 3 endowed lectures presented annually by the Kasdan Institute. And the Lewis Lecture was established in the honor of USC alumnus Burton Lewis, and it traditionally has focused on Jewish themes related to the arts and American culture, a topic that was of great interest and close to the heart of Mr. Lewis. And we are honored to present this event in conjunction with our partnering institutions, the Jewish Community Foundation, the USC Shoah Foundation, and ICAR Los Angeles, all of whom have worked tremendously hard to bring together today's event that's going to feature myself in conversation with Stephen Smith, Executive Director of the USC Shoah Foundation. And as you can see on the board, we're going to talk about my recent book, Hitler in Los Angeles, How Jews Foiled Nazi Plots Against Hollywood and America. I would like to express a special thanks to the Jewish Community Foundation, which has underwritten the cost of many of our events, including today's program. And I do want to take a moment to really thank them, because without the financial help, we would not be able to continue the events we have, and particularly expand our programming. Most recently, our USC Goes to Temple series, where we have begun partnering with temples around the city, rather than expect members of the community always to come to USC. We believe it is our job to take our events out into the community and come to you. The Jewish Community Foundation manages more than $1 billion in charitable assets and has been helping its donors conduct their philanthropy more effectively for over 60 years. And the foundation's 1,300 donors have awarded over $97 million in grants to several thousand nonprofits just last year. These grants support a wide array of causes, Jewish or general, local, national, and in Israel. And as a matter of fact, we're quite proud to report that over the last 20 years, the foundation and its donors have contributed nearly $13 million to USC. We're delighted to welcome several of the foundation leaders. I'm not sure they're all here. Lisa, is Lou Groner here yet? No, okay. Well, I guess we're not. Leah Lau? Leah, hi. And Elizabeth Austin, is Elizabeth here? No, okay. So I'm not going to invite Lou to say a few words, since he's not here. But several reminders before we get started. If you are not on our mailing list and would like to be, when you leave after the event today, right outside there where we have our Kasdan annuals, there's a sign-up sheet for the mailing list. We do not give your names or emails out to anyone else, so the mailing list is only for internal use. In addition, if you want to learn more about tonight's topics, copies of Hitler in Los Angeles are for sale outside. I am honored to share the stage today with Dr. Stephen Smith. And Stephen is the Andrew J. and Erna Finchie Viterbi Endowed Executive Director of the USC Shoah Foundation and the Institute for Visual History and Education. And he also holds the UNESCO Chair on Genocide Education. And on top of that, he's an adjunct professor in the Department of Religion at USC. And Dr. Smith is committed to making the testimony of survivors of the Holocaust and of other crimes against humanity a compelling voice for education and action. His leadership at the Shoah Foundation is focused on finding strategies to optimize the effectiveness of testimonies for education, research, and advocacy purposes. A theologian by training, Stephen has particular interest in the impact of the Holocaust on religious and philosophical thought and practice. He wrote his PhD dissertation on the topic, The Trajectory of Memory, examining how Holocaust survivor narratives have developed over time and shaped the ways in which the implications of the Holocaust are understood. He founded the UK Holocaust Centre in Nottinghamshire, England, and co-founded the Aegis Trust for the Prevention of Crimes Against Humanity and Genocide. He was also the inaugural chairman of the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, which runs the National Holocaust Memorial Day in the United Kingdom. Finally, Stephen is involved in memorial projects around the world. He is currently a delegate of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance and was the project director responsible for the creation of the Kigali Genocide Memorial Center in Rwanda. And he serves as a trustee of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation. And I'm very proud and pleased to say I was on the search committee that hired Stephen, and he blew us away then, and he has continued to exceed all expectations as an international leader. And in fact, he's just telling me he's just returned from Washington, where he was with kids in Florida at Stoneman who were in a Shoah class at the time of the shooting. As for today's format, it's going to be slightly unusual. It's neither a lecture nor a total conversation, but a hybrid. I'm going to talk for 20 minutes, giving you a kind of overview of some of the themes of the book, and then Stephen and I will engage in a conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we will throw it open to all of you for Q&A for 20, 30 minutes. We will say thank you, and then have you all stay for our reception. So, I guess that means, without further ado, I introduce myself. I want to start by telling you a story, and it's a story you've never heard before. This is, for those of you who can't quite see, this is a map of Nazi and fascist Los Angeles in the 1930s and 40s. It's a map I designed with my colleague Philip Ethington in the history department. Everything in red is either a Nazi or fascist group, and I would just add that I could not fit all the fascist groups downtown on the map. Otherwise, all you would have seen is red, and you wouldn't have been able to read anything at all. Imagine then, as you listen to this, that you are living in 1930s Los Angeles, and you go downtown, and this is what you see. My story begins, and it's a story, it begins in the 30s, in 1933, and it's a story of a time when hate groups moved from the margins to the mainstream of American society, and when government authorities seemed either complacent or complicit. And the story begins in January 1933, when Adolf Hitler became Reich Chancellor of Germany. In March 1933, he sent Captain Robert Pape, a World War I veteran, to Los Angeles with the task of organizing Nazi groups all along the Pacific coast. And if you look at the picture here, the top image is April, I believe it's 1935, April 20th, Hitler's birthday celebration at Deutsche House. And, you know, when you first look at it, you would think this is Germany, and then you see the American flag. No, folks, this is about a mile from where we are sitting right now. This is Figueroa, and a little more than a mile. This is Figueroa and 15th Street. And the bottom image Imagine you are walking in downtown Los Angeles in the 1930s and you're on Broadway. And imagine how you feel about seeing swastika flags flying from stores, proudly displaying it. Well, on July 26th, 1933, Nazis held their first open meeting in Los Angeles at the Alt-Heidelberg Inn on Alvarado Street, just west of downtown Los Angeles. And at that meeting, they declared that they were going to save America from its two greatest enemies, communists and Jews. And they predicted one day the communists would rise up to try to overthrow the government. And when they did, trained Nazis and their allies would rise up, oppose them, defeat them. Well, the problem is Jewish groups around the country were doing things. Historians have asked why didn't Jews do more? The answer is they did, but they had a divided strategy. And a divided strategy is not the same as no strategy. And the divided strategy was the American Jewish Congress, led by Rabbi Stephen Wise, that believed they had to take an aggressive stance towards Hitler and Nazi Germany. They needed to get into Hitler's face, and they did so by organizing an international boycott of all German products until Germany stopped persecuting Jews and all minority groups. On the other hand, you had the American Jewish Committee, led by Judge Proskauer of the firm Proskauer Rose, who argued that if you get in Hitler's face, he will only double down. And consequently, they advocated working behind the scenes with religious leaders in Germany to pressure Hitler into easing his policies. Well, all this talk was happening, but after July 26th, Leon Lewis said, enough talk, something needs to be done now. Leon Lewis was born in Wisconsin in the late 1880s. He graduated from the University of Chicago Law School in 1913, and he decided instead of going to work in a law firm, he dedicated himself to the Jewish concept of tikkun olam, healing the world. And he took the position of a newly organized group called the Anti-Defamation League. And he was their founding executive secretary. Leon Lewis went off to war as an enlisted man and wound up as a captain. He returned to Chicago and convinced his other two board members that they needed to establish an international division to monitor fascism and Nazism in Europe. And of course, for any of you who've ever been in an organization, if you have a good idea to start something new, you're going to be asked to take it over. So Leon Lewis was both the international secretary and the national executive secretary. But what that meant more than anything else is during the 1920s, there was probably no American following Hitler's rise to power more carefully than Leon Lewis. And one of the things Leon Lewis knew is that many Americans, when they saw that newspaper and they saw the picture of 5 brown shirts with their swastika armbands and their hands out in a Hitler salute, that many people looking at this image would see them either as thugs or Keystone cops. And Lewis understood that the Nazi threat was far more dangerous than that in fact, Nazi leaders didn't look like thugs. They looked like Captain Robert Pape. They looked like Hermann Schwinn, who would rise up to become the number 2 Nazi in all of America, replace Pape, and take over as both the head of the entire Western United States, and as I say, the number 2 Nazi in the United States. And finally, Hans Winterhalter and Paul Themlitz, who are the propaganda chief and at the very early on, the owner of the Aryan bookstore and the number 2 person. And I show these images because Nazis did not look like Nazis. The leadership dressed in suits, they dressed in ties, and their ordinariness made them far more dangerous than the men running around in brown shirts. Well, Leon Lewis decided he needed to do something because he knew that the Nazis were trying to raise an army in Los Angeles in the same way Hitler had tried to raise an army in Germany in the 20s. And that is, Hitler raised his brown shirts from disgruntled World War I veterans who had fought for their country and then were thrown on the ash heap of history. Men who, whether you agree or disagree with the cause, had followed their country's call for patriotism, had served their nation, and now they were starving to death. In our own country, a similar situation happened. In March 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt took power as president, he and Congress, the very first act they passed was the Economy Act of 1933 that cut military benefits, veteran benefits, from $80, $100 a month down to $20 or zero. That led to enormous protest by military veterans around the country. And the Nazis believed that they could take advantage of that disgruntled protest. And remember, Southern California had the largest collection of World War I veterans of anywhere in the nation, over 150,000 World War I veterans. And the Nazi idea was they were going to recruit from amongst those disgruntled veterans. And they also knew that American veterans were not likely to follow Germans, but they would follow their own leaders. And so they were very anxious to recruit military officers. Well, Leon Lewis knew this. Leon Lewis knew this because he had followed the strategy all through the 20s. And so he decided he was going to go, and he traveled from his office on 7th Street and Flower down a few blocks to right here, right by the freeway. Probably most of you have seen Bob Hope Patriotic Hall. Well, that was built in 1926 by the county supervisors, called Patriotic Hall, and it was a meeting place for veterans groups. And Leon Lewis was both a member of the Disabled American Veterans and a member of the American Legion. And he thought if Nazis want to recruit an army, he's going to send them officers they can recruit. The only problem is these officers and their wives were going to go undercover for Leon Lewis and join every Nazi and fascist group in Los Angeles and to rise to positions of leadership, which they all did. His first and most important recruit was John Schmidt, Captain John Schmidt. Captain John Schmidt was born in Germany. He was the son of a Bavarian general. His brother was a high-ranking officer in the German military. He had been a military cadet in Germany until the age of 16, when he came to America, enlisted in the army, fought with General Pershing in Mexico, and then fought against his own family in World War I for the American troops. He recruited Carl Sunderland, who had spent most of his life in the cavalry. He recruited Major C. Burt Allen, again, and their wives. And his last recruit and his only Jewish spy, Colonel William Conley, who did not look very Jewish, but was in fact the national commander of the Disabled American Veterans, who was touring the country denouncing the Roosevelt administration for its callous treatment of veterans. Mind you, the Nazis referred to the Roosevelt administration as the Rosenfeld administration and talked about the Jew deal. Well, within a few weeks, Lewis's 4 spies uncovered a plot to sabotage and seize armories in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego. They had met Dietrich Gefgen, who had fled Germany in the 1920s after shooting and murdering 2 communist organizers. He then went to San Francisco, joined the National Guard, and while serving in the National Guard, he laid out a blueprint of the entire armory there, where all the weapons were stored, all the ammunition was stored, where the enlisted men stayed, and where the officers' quarters were. He then went down to San Diego and, working with his American companions in hate, the Silver Shirts, he persuaded them to join their group. And finally, in Los Angeles, he met with these 4 spies, asked them to get him the blueprint for the LA Armory and to get him machine guns. And he told them that on the appointed day, Nazis who were secretly training all along the West Coast in every major city. In fact, in LA, we had a stormtrooper unit that was secretly training. We had the Silver Shirts who were secretly training along with the stormtroopers, both in buildings inside with pistol practice, but also in the Hollywood Hills and out in the Palisades. And finally, they would be joined by stormtroopers on German vessels. Every German vessel that docked along the Pacific coast in the 30s had a small unit of stormtroopers in it. And on the appointed day, they would seize the armories in all three cities. Any National Guard enlisted man or officer who agreed to join them would be welcomed, and anyone who refused would be murdered on the spot. Well, Leon Lewis never intended to be a spy master. Leon Lewis only did this because no one seemed to be paying attention. And his idea was, I will have my 4 spies gather enough information, bring it to the authorities, and then the authorities will take over because that's what they do. I'm just an attorney. Well, the first person he went to was Police Chief James Two Gun Davis, known as Two Gun he loved to pose this way. There are many pictures like this, because he had won the National Police Pistol Shooting Championship with both his left hand and his right hand. And the one take home from today, other than the Nazis, is it was James Two Gun Davis who coined the term, shoot first, ask questions later. So Leon Lewis, in a memo he wrote right after the meeting, talked about, he was telling Police Chief Davis all about this plot to seize the armories, when 2 minutes into his explanation, Davis stopped him and said, you don't get it. You don't get it. Hitler's only doing what he needs to do to save Germany from the Jews. And in fact, the real problem in LA are not Nazis and fascists. The real problems are just east of downtown in Boyle Heights, all those commies and all those Jews. And basically, he threw Lewis out of his office. Lewis then went to see Sheriff Eugene Biscaluz, who, what turned out, was good friends with the German council, and he refused to do anything. And finally, Lewis went to the FBI, and he found some sympathy there, but they said there's nothing we can do unless we're ordered to by Washington. Well, in 1933, there were only 300 agents across the country. And J. Edgar Hoover, who I am convinced, I don't have the evidence, but as a historian I could tell you sometimes you just know things and then you find the evidence that confirms it. J. Edgar Hoover was an anti-Semite, and J. Edgar Hoover didn't think that Nazis and fascists were a problem, and he refused to have any Nazi or fascist put under surveillance. In fact, I have Herman Schwinn, who I mentioned, #2 Nazi in America. I got his Freedom of Information Act file, and the first FBI record is in 1942. Herman Schwinn was not put under surveillance by the FBI until November 15th, 1941, 3 weeks before Pearl Harbor. Well, Leon Lewis realized that he had to continue with this spy operation. And from 1933 until the end of World War II, he kept turning over spies because either they were testifying at court cases, testifying before the House Un-American Activities Committee, or in the case of 3 of his spies, they met with suspicious deaths. But he foiled the plot, not only to seize the armories, he foiled a plot to drive through Boyle Heights with machine guns, shooting Jews to death, to create a phony fumigation company that would pump cyanide into the homes of Jews, to seize military installations along the Pacific coast, and finally he foiled 2 plots, mass murder plots, one to kill 20 prominent Jewish figures and the other to kill 24 famous Hollywood figures. And just for the next few minutes, I'm going to give you the outline of 2 of those plots. One of his ace agents was Chuck Slocum, born in Oakland, raised in Long Beach. Chuck Slocum joined the Ku Klux Klan sometime either late 20s or very early 30s, because he was an ardent anti-communist. But after a short time, he realized the Klan didn't just hate commies. They hated Jews, blacks, and Catholics, and he didn't hate anybody except for communists. So he actually went to work undercover for the police captain in Long Beach, and then he went to work for Leon Lewis as Agent C-19. And over the course of time, he foiled two of the most nefarious plots. One, started by Ingram Hughes, who in September 1935, imagine, today's a Sunday, imagine waking up on a Sunday, opening your LA Times, and this is what comes out of the Times. He printed this up. He had worked as a linotype operator at the Times. He had friends there, anti-Semitic friends, who secretly inserted this into every edition of the Sunday Times. And the key expression here is it calls on all dedicated, loyal, devout Christians to join him in, quote, enacting the final solution of the Jewish problem that cannot be attained through legislative methods. And his final solution was going to involve kidnapping 20 prominent Los Angeles Jews, including Leon Lewis, Mendel Silberberg, the most famous entertainment attorney in the city, and a number of the city's leaders. They would kidnap them, they would bring them to an isolated park, and then to show their utter contempt for Jews, they planned to get machine guns and shoot their bodies so full of lead that it would tear the bodies in half. And the plot didn't happen because Chuck Slocum convinced him that Leon Lewis had spies in the operation. In fact, very early on, the Nazis and fascists knew Leon Lewis was running a spy ring, and they referred to him as the most dangerous Jew in Los Angeles. They just didn't know who the spies were, and they never really found out. And so Slocum convinced Hughes that if they went ahead with the plot and murdered the Jews, they would all be arrested and spend the rest of their lives in jail. And so Hughes agreed to postpone the plot, and it was postponed forever. But a second plot, and even more dangerous, was organized by Captain Leopold McLaughlin, a British war veteran who had fought in the Boer War, fought in World War I. And as you can see here, he's the figure all the way over on the left, and he's kind of crunched down because he's somewhere between 6'6" and 6'8". He's huge. He's also the world's jiu-jitsu champion, and he is the brother of Victor McLaughlin, who won the Oscar in 1935 for, of all things, the movie called The Informer. Well, Leopold McLaughlin met with three of the main fascist leaders, silver shirt leaders in Los Angeles, and plotted a murder plot. They were going to blow up the homes of 24 of the leading Hollywood figures, 22 Jews, including Louis B. Mayer, Samuel Goldwyn, Jack Warner, as well as two movie stars who were known to be too close to the Jews, Charlie Chaplin and James Cagney, who many of you may not know spoke fluent Yiddish. Well, this plot got so close that Leon Lewis told Slocum, we have to stop it now. And so Slocum managed to convince his other two companions, the first fascist of Los Angeles, Henry Allen, whose wife was the head of, the women's division of the Silver Shirts, and his son had been thrown out of junior high for trying to organize junior high Silver Shirts. Henry Allen hated Jews so much he carried what he called his kite killer in a car with him at all times. If you can see in the corner of the car, there's like a plastic handle, and that's attached to a 2x4 piece of wood. And one day Slocum talked about how he had, in fact, pulled off the side of the road. Thank you. Henry Allen pulled off the side of the road to show Slocum how you kill Jews with a kite killer. And he showed him how first you shove it in the guy's stomach, and when he bent over, you hit him on the skull and kept hitting him till you heard his skull crack. Well, Slocum convinced Henry Allen and Mr. Alexander, the head, Ken Alexander, the head of the Silver Shirts, that McLaughlin was going to betray them. They would commit the murders, and then he would turn them in and turn state's evidence. So they went to the DA's office and turned him in, and it never happened. This is where they met, 1937, La Crescenta Park. Again, this is not Germany. This is 17 miles northeast of downtown, and at that time it was called Hindenburg Park, and it was owned and run by the Nazis in LA. Well, McLaughlin was never brought up on charges of attempted murder. He was brought up only on extortion charges, mainly because Leon Lewis decided to play the long game. He found out that part of the plotters were in the police department and in the sheriff's department, and that McLaughlin had also hoodwinked naval intelligence. And rather than embarrass all three units, he figured, if I don't tell the press what really happened, they will owe me. And so McLaughlin was eventually found guilty of extortion and given the choice of 5 years in jail, or if he left the country on the next boat, his sentence would be suspended. His brother Victor immediately bought the next ticket out to Liverpool, and he was gone. The last thing, and then I want to close, is Pearl Harbor happens December 7th. On December 8th, the FBI, with tremendous success, within 24 hours, rounds up the most dangerous Nazis, Italian fascists, and Japanese. And the question I ask myself is, since the FBI had been, since 1940, the LA unit had been asking Hoover to put Herman Schwinn under surveillance, and Hoover refused, saying Herman Schwinn has broken no law. But that didn't stop him from putting dozens of Hollywood figures under surveillance, alleged communists. And so if he didn't know anything about the Nazis, how did they know who to arrest? And the answer is, Leon Lewis, starting in September 1939 with his assistant Joe Roos, sent lists. They had compiled lists gathered from their spies and informants of dangerous Nazis that they divided into three categories: most dangerous, dangerous, and put under surveillance. They sent those lists to the FBI, to military intelligence, and to naval intelligence. And I went down to Washington and got some of the files and found the FBI memo that went out to them and discovered, what did the FBI do? They took Leon Lewis's lists, retyped them, including the comments Lewis made about each person, and passed them off as their own. But Lewis never cared because it got the job done. So what is the take-home? Leon Lewis and the courageous men and women who followed him understood that democracy requires constant vigilance. That without ever firing a gun, without ever picking up a weapon, they defeated a whole range of enemies. And that they showed that when a government fails to stem the rise of hate in America, it is up to every American, regardless of their race, religion, politics, to protect the lives of every other American. And I want to close by paraphrasing Leon Lewis's statement that he made at the end of the war, which is, only in a unified America can we achieve the true realization of the American dream. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And thank you for being on my search committee. It's great to get some payback and ask you some questions now.
Okay.
First of all, a quick show of hands. How many people have already read this book? So a handful. Okay, great. That just gives an idea as to...
They're waiting for the movie.
Yeah. Well, to that point, you know, everyone was very concerned about the book industry and how it would fold when Kindle came out. But what actually happened is I did what I normally do. I went and I got a copy of the hard book, the first edition of Hitler in Los Angeles, and I put it on my bookshelf, which he signed. Then I got my Audible version for my car, and then I got my Kindle version so I could make notes for tonight. So I have 3 copies. You know, it was the Audible version that caught me, though, because I live in West Hollywood. and they drive along those streets and come down those streets to get to USC every day. And I was listening to your book unfolding on the very streets that are depicted in the book and realizing just how close this is. And we're going to get to the seriousness of this situation as our conversation unfolds, Steve. But as I was listening to the book, I got the sense that, first of all, I was listening to a spy thriller, firstly, and secondly, that you rather enjoyed writing this. Tell me about that.
Yes, on both counts. Like many of my colleagues, I like to read spy novels and mystery. I get a lot of flack from my wife for not reading serious fiction, but I figure I read enough serious stuff during the day. I just want to have fun. And I particularly have loved John le Carré. I've loved Ben McIntyre. I've loved Eric Larson in The Garden of Beasts. And once I found this story, I realized this was such an amazing story that all I had to do was not get in the way of the story and blow it. And that there were so many plots that the book may seem long now, but I cut 100 pages off the manuscript I sent to the press because there were too many characters. And I decided to write it to the extent I could. I wanted to write it as a thriller because here's the thing. What we need to understand, many of you may have heard about this book that came out in 2013 called The Collaboration, Hollywood's Plot with Hitler, or I can't even quite what it was, but it basically was a book by a man named Ben Irwan that said, we always knew that the Hollywood moguls cooperated with Nazi Germany, but it went way beyond cooperation, it was collaboration, and that they should have known better, and that they should have done more to stop the war and the Holocaust. And I thought, this is a horrible book. This is a ahistorical book. Knowing how, well, he claims a certain righteousness because he's the grandson of Holocaust survivors. I'm the son of Holocaust survivors. My father was in Dachau, my mother was in Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and then Salzwedel, a munitions camp in Salzwedel, Germany. And the thing that many of these people who write about this don't understand is when Leon Lewis started his organization, started the spy ring, he didn't know a war was coming. He didn't know a Holocaust was coming, but he did know there was a hate group in America that was bent on murdering Jews. And I thought, my God, and I kept coming across plot after plot after plot, and I thought, how does this man sleep at night? And so I tried to write a book that would capture that kind of attention. And believe me, I didn't invent a single piece of drama. The drama was just there for me to report.
But of course, at the back of the book, your profession is very evident in the pages and pages and pages of notes, which I have to confess I did not read, but were evidence of the research methodology that you applied. Can you just talk a little bit about that methodology? Where were these archives? How did you find these people? What were all these documents? Where were they sitting? How did you discover them? Why were they not discovered before?
Those are a bunch of questions.
Well, that was what was going through my mind as I was reading this. Well, how?
Well, first of all, as somebody trained in the East Coast, I went to Columbia as an undergraduate. I did a degree at Oxford and at Princeton. There's a general sense in the Ivy Leagues that life stops west of the Hudson River. And so, you know, we have been very late in the history profession to really do Western history and to do urban history and to take cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco seriously as major national cities. It's only now, really in the last decade or two. So no one was trying to discover archives, and I put myself in that group as well. But I had written the book before this. It was called Hollywood Left and Right, How Movie Stars Shaped American Politics. And I was writing a chapter on Edward G. Robinson. And fortunately, his papers are here at USC. So I started with those. And I came across his involvement in the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League, and I got very interested in how movie stars, starting in 1936, used their celebrity to oppose Nazism and fascism, both domestically and internationally. And I wanted to find out more about Nazism in LA, so I went online and I found this online exhibit that Cal State Northridge Special Collections had put up called In Our Own Backyard, Nazis and Fascists in Los Angeles. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I don't know anything about this, other than I know people protesting. So I went to Cal State Northridge and discovered there's like over 200 boxes dealing with this. And I'm a slow writer to begin with, and I just couldn't spend weeks trying to find what would be maybe a page in the book. But I thought, when I'm done with this, I'm going to go back and see what's there. And I did. I went back and I spent several weeks and I had no idea what was going on, because Leon Lewis was always a step ahead of his enemy. And he anticipated, remember, he ran this out of a modest 3-room office. It's the Roosevelt building, it's still there. I think the numbers they renumbered buildings from the 30s to today, but it's on 7th, just east of Flower. And he was afraid that if Nazis and fascists they knew he was running a spy ring, they'd break into his office, try to steal the files, and discover who his spies were. So every spy had a code name, and it was organized in such a way that I couldn't figure out what was going on. And it was very frustrating. And I knew there was a spy here and a spy there. And then I found out that his his associate spy master, Joe Roos, had left his papers at USC. And I went there and discovered he had written an autobiography with Len Pitt, a historian at Cal State Northridge, who brought those archives to Northridge. And after reading 30 pages of his autobiography that laid out exactly what they were doing, I jumped out of my seat, because I wanted to be a polite library patron and didn't want to yell there. Went into the hallway and called my wife, and I said, I got a book. I know what's going on now. And so Leon Lewis has all his spies are coded, and at the back of the book, even I got confused and forgot whose code name was what. So at the back of the book, there's a guide to the spies, to the Nazis, to the allies who were helping him. And that's when I realized what the story was, that this was a very elaborate spy ring. And I thought, oh my God, this is the stuff I read all the time. And it actually happened in LA. And because it was at Cal State Northridge, which is not on the map for historians for archives, no one had really bothered to look at this before.
And let's talk about Leon Lewis for a moment. You referenced him extensively a moment ago. But just talk about him as a man, as a person in the middle of this, what now we know was a maelstrom of hatred that was happening right on the streets of Los Angeles. And he comes in from outside of Los Angeles. Presumably, he has to find his way around, start to identify people. How does somebody even begin that process? What kind of person was he, do you find, in all of those papers?
He was somebody who stayed out of the limelight. He liked to do things, he liked to run things, but he never wanted to take the credit for it. He wanted to get the job done. Something I realized here working with one of the former provosts, Lloyd Armstrong, who's the one I think responsible more than anyone else for USC making the great leap forward. And Lloyd's belief was, if you let faculty take all the credit, then you can get anything done in this place. And Leon Lewis was happy to let other people take the credit. He never left any memoirs. He left no papers other than these documents. So it was very hard to get a sense of who he was as a man, other than he was totally dedicated to Jewish life. He helped found the B'nai B'rith, Hillel. B'nai B'rith was the founding organization group for the ADL. He helped found the Hillels on campuses around the country. He also, starting in 1915, and this is what helped his transition to LA, he assumed the position of the ADL's representative to the motion picture industry, and he was working with the studio heads for years before this, monitoring anti-Semitic images in films. And even when he moved out to LA in 1930-31, he remained the ADL's representative to Southern California, and he also maintained his position as the ADL's representative to the movie industry, working with all the moguls. So when he needed to get funds, when he realized he was about to run out of money, because, again, he never expected to be a spy master, and in his memos, he talks about how, so he starts this in August 33, and by November, he had raised a few bucks from Jews in LA, but he had run out of it, and he was paying for this out of his own pocket, and he had 2 small children, and he finally said, I'm going bankrupt. My clients have all left me because I'm paying all my attention to the spy operation. And so he turned to 3 people to help him raise money secretly. Irving Thalberg, the number 2 person at MGM, Rabbi Edgar Magnin, the rabbi of the Big Dog Temple in Los Angeles, Wilshire Boulevard Temple, and finally the most important person, Mendel Silberberg. How many of you know that name, Mendel Silberberg? All right, how many of you know the name Lou Wasserman? Okay, imagine Lou Wasserman on steroids. Mendel, as powerful as Wasserman was, he looks like a child. Mendel Silberberg was the most powerful entertainment attorney in America. He represented most of the studios, most of the studio heads, and most of the famous actors and actresses, on top of which he was one of the 5 Republican kingmakers. That is, he's one of the 5 guys who went in that proverbial smoke-filled room at the convention to decide who is going to be the next GOP presidential candidate. And I have the long chapter here that was so much fun to write, and my daughter's told me, if this gets made into a movie, she wants a part. In this Hillcrest, sometimes I say hillside, no, it's different. Mendel Silberberg calls up the 40 of the most powerful figures in Hollywood and tells them on March 13th, show up at 6 o'clock at Hillcrest Country Club. And they do. And they walk into this room, private dining room, where there are 40 seats, and in front of every seat are copies of the Silver Ranger, which is the Silver Shirt magazine, and it's filled with anti-Semitic articles, and particularly hatred of the movie moguls. And he proceeds to tell them, not only do these people hate your guts, but many of you are only concerned with your above-the-line people, your stars, your directors, your producers, but my spies have discovered that the Nazis and fascists are organizing all your blue-collar workers, your below-the-line workers, which are 70 to 80% of the studio employees, and that he turns to that at Paramount. Paramount's right now 100% Aryan. Louis, MGM, virtually 100% Aryan. Columbia Studios, virtually 100% Aryan. And they have systematically been firing Jews, and no one knew about it. And then he tells them, and by the way, there are hit lists, and your names are on the hit list. He walked out of that meeting with the equivalent in today's dollars of $424,000. And one of the things that blows me away is this may be the first time in over 3,000 years of Jewish history that Jews kept an important secret. I have never read anything about this meeting in anybody's memoir or anything. People knew the stakes were too high.
Let's go back to the title of the book, Hitler in Los Angeles. Was Hitler in Los Angeles ever?
Well, he tried a screen test at MGM, and had he gotten that role, history might have been different. No. No, one of my friends asked me why. When was Hitler in L.A.? It's a metaphor.
So let's talk about the relationship between the Nazi regime
Right.
and what was happening on the streets of L.A. Just unfold that for a moment.
Right. Part of the reason that I did call it Hitler in L.A. is I think it's a wonderful title, and it encapsulates what it's about. It's about Nazis in this city. And for Adolf Hitler and for his Reich Minister of Propaganda and Enlightenment, Joseph Goebbels, L.A., not New York, was the most important city in the United States. And New York, which they referred to as Jew York, they avoided because the mayor of New York, Fiorello LaGuardia, was a rabid anti-Nazi, anti-fascist. And many of you may not know that, his father was Italian, but his mother was Jewish. So depending on what part of the tribe you're in, he was a Jew. But he made sure that his Port Authority people went onto every German ship that docked in New York and searched it for propaganda, weapons, and anything. Whereas LA was an open port, where the reports I have from Leon Lewis's spies talk about them driving Hermann Schwinn down to the docks and being with him when the captain on the vessel gave him secret documents that he could see had red wax seals on them. He could see the captain handing Schwinn big envelopes of money, and he also knew they were picking up propaganda illegally from the docks.
But also, I think the
movie
industry, Hollywood, played a big role in this, right?
Right, and the second reason, so the first reason is logistically they can get spies, money, propaganda through the LA ports, which were then sent throughout the rest of the United States. The other reason why LA was so important is LA was the movie capital of the world. And Hitler and Goebbels both watched movies every night. And Hitler believed that Germany lost World War I in part because of the effective propaganda of the British and American movie industries. And he was determined to make sure that they would not be able to use that propaganda against the Nazi regime. And so he sent out a German consul, George Gissling, to LA with one mission only, which is, to stop Hollywood from making any anti-Nazi film. And the weapon he had was the German import law of 1931, which had Section 15 that said, any studio that produces a film that in any way is detrimental to German honor or prestige will have all its films banned. And if enough films come out of any one nation, enough studios in any one nation produce these kind of films, all those films from that nation will be banned in Germany.
And was Germany a big enough commercial market to matter?
It was the largest market on the continent and the second largest market next to Great Britain.
So did that affect the movies that got made?
Yes, it did, because right from the start, George Gissling would go into screening rooms and he would watch the films. He would write down scenes that he thought were unacceptable and then force the studios to cut those scenes. And they did. When Warner Brothers refused to do so, Warner Brothers films were banned throughout Germany.
And did that have an impact on them?
Not on Warner Brothers, no, but the rest of the studios were playing the waiting game. They believed that Hitler was a buffoon, that Hitler would not finish his term in office, that eventually the German people would wake up and get rid of him, and all they had to do was wait him out. And that never happened.
You know, in spy thrillers, everyone's got multiple characters. That only unfolds as the thriller unfolds, and we see this in your book. But we have a little bit more of a bird's eye view because, as the historian, you're also walking us through.
Right.
But there are a lot of characters in there that who were not in the spy ring, but also have these duplicitous characters. I think you just mentioned Gissling just a moment ago. Just talk about some of those characters on what looked like the Nazi side, and indeed were on the Nazi side, but may have had other roles that unfolded.
Well, the biggest reveal in the entire book is George Gissling, he is the German consul to Los Angeles. He's been the villain of countless Hollywood histories. If any of you are watching the Amazon series, The Last Tycoon, he's in that series as well. And he was very effective at his job. His job in stopping Hollywood from making any anti-Nazi films was made easier in 1934, July 34, when the industry passed the production code, which basically said in order to get into a first-run movie theater, where studios made 70 to 80% of their profit, you needed a seal from the production code. And you could not get a seal if you abrogated one of their code restrictions. And one was you cannot make any movie that attacks, mocks, or denigrates a foreign nation or a leader. So it made it very difficult for Hollywood to do anything. And in fact, there would be no anti-Nazi movie until Confessions of a Nazi Spy in April 1939. Well, George Gissling was very good at his job and remained very good until he left the country when Roosevelt expelled all German diplomats in June 1941. But I was very curious at the start to know who was this guy? And I wanted to know, how did LA society, respectable non-Jewish society, the power elite, the social elite, how did they react to this man? And so I read the social column in the LA Times from when he arrived here in June 1933 until he left in June 41, and discovered that he was by far the most beloved diplomat in the city all those years, that he was sophisticated, he spoke multiple languages, he was charming, he was considered handsome, he was an Olympian. While he had been stationed in New York, apparently the German bobsled team, the B team, had a catastrophic accident and everyone was eliminated. And so they put together a very quick team, and they asked Gissling, who was something like 6'4", to be part of the team, although he had never been in a bobsled. But he did, and he finished last. But nevertheless, he was an Olympian, and he was treated with great respect by the city's social leaders, and they vied to dance with him. They vied to have, when his wife left, they vied to have parties at his house and be the hostess. But something struck me as off. He reminded me of my father-in-law. My father-in-law had been in Germany, had been in medical school until Hitler threw Jews out of medical school. He went to Padua and went to medical school there for a year until Mussolini threw the Jews out, and he wound up at Northwestern University where he finished his degree. And he remained a German nationalist until his dying day. He loved German opera, he loved German music, German literature, anything German culture, he just absorbed. And I used to say to him, Kurt, how can you do this after what Hitler has done? And his response was, ugh, Hitler was an aberration. I'm not going to let this man spoil hundreds of years of German culture. And I thought, Gissling's kind of like my father-in-law. I just couldn't believe a man this sophisticated. He spoke, I think, 4 or 5 languages. He had been educated at a special gymnasium in Switzerland that specialized in ancient languages and literature. I thought, this guy can't be a Nazi. And so I started digging around, and I got the Nuremberg trial records from 1945, 46, 47, and found a letter from Brigadier General Julius Klein that started, this is to the tribunal, this is the first and only personal testimonial I will ever write for a Nazi, because George Gissling is no Nazi. George Gissling has been working for the restoration of democracy in Germany. He is a German nationalist, and from 1933 on, he has been passing me valuable secret information about the German economy, about the Bund, and in 1940, after a meeting in Washington, about German war plans. And it turned out that he was, it's hard to call him a double agent because he didn't work for the Jews per se, but he hated Hitler. I tracked down his daughter, who was born in New York and left the country at age 13 and went back to Germany, and eventually married, after the war, married a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force intelligence, and then moved to Morro Bay. And I interviewed her and discovered, and that filled in all the things I didn't know about her father. And he was an incredibly courageous man, because if word had ever leaked out that he was in fact passing any information to the Jews, he would have been murdered on the spot.
Earlier last year, we saw images coming out of Charlottesville of a really interesting, what felt like a throwback in history of a number of supremacist groups, Nazi groups coming together with all the youth that went with that last year. Your book reveals that the Silver Shirts, the Nazis, the Ku Klux Klan, they were all working together. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Because it wasn't just one group, right?
Right. They formed the United Fascist Alliance in Los Angeles, all dedicated to eliminating Jews from America. And, you know, the difference between Charlottesville and LA, and, you know, people ask me, isn't it a return to the past? And I say, well, yes, in a sense, but things were worse. Because remember, in Charlottesville, they were chanting the Jews will not, they being neo-Nazis and white supremacists were chanting the Jews will not replace us. But in Los Angeles from 1933 until the end of World War II, 1945, it didn't stop at Pearl Harbor. Virtually every month, and in many cases from 33 to I'd say 38, virtually every week, somebody was openly calling for death to Jews in these meetings. And in fact, the plots, just the two plots I revealed here, were being the partners in those were going to be the Nazis, the silver shirts, the white Russians who brought you the pogroms in Odessa and in the Ukraine, the Klan, and a number of these hate groups that are up here, the American Nationalist Party, the American Rangers, all these groups that have patriotic-sounding names. And that's what makes me afraid and what makes me cringe is when the President of the United States talks about America first. Anybody with a historical memory knows that America first, not everybody in America first was a fascist or a Nazi. There were American firsters who believed in not getting involved in World War II because war never solves the problem. So they wanted to stay out of the war. But there were many people who were isolationists only until such time that Hitler would conquer Europe, and then they were pro-Hitler, hoping Hitler would conquer America.
There's a part of this which, as one reads it, you can see just so many mistakes, faux pas, kind of comical errors in a way that were happening as these events were unfolding. Could you just talk a moment, though, about how serious you think this threat was? The intent behind it and the practical threat that there was to Jews living in Los Angeles and to Los Angeles as a city writ large.
Well, I can only make counterfactual arguments because we don't know. But I can tell you I am absolutely convinced that not all of these plots would have succeeded, but a number of them would have succeeded and a number of Jews would have been killed. More to the point, what I really know would have happened is Los Angeles was the leading manufacturing center of aircraft in America. And starting around 39, 40, 41, Leon Lewis and Joe Roos started getting spies and informants in all the aircraft factories. And not just in the factories, but they had some recruits, in particular one waitress, German-speaking waitress who hated Hitler as well, would overhear German workers from the aircraft plants would get in their cups, have a little too much to drink, and they would talk about on the day that the United States entered the war, they were going to sabotage the aircraft factories. And that some of them were saying they'd already begun sabotaging planes, leaving bolts out of certain things, and all this was then reported to Leon Lewis, and from Lewis it went to Army and Naval Intelligence and the FBI.
And to that point, this book is also about women. We haven't seen any of the women in the book at the moment and heard about them, but there's a number of really key women in this story.
Right. Three of the women. One is John Schmidt, who I mentioned was the first spy. His wife also was fluent in German, and they attended so many meetings at what was then called the Friends of New Germany, which in '36 became the German-American Bund, that she was asked to become the president of the Women's Auxiliary for the Friends of New Germany, and she was taken to the upstairs offices where no one except the German officers in the Friends of New Germany were taken, and they asked her to help translate secret correspondence coming back and forth to Germany, and to make sure no one, even her husband, wasn't told about this. Well, everything she translated went right to Leon Lewis because she had her own code name, and she too risked her life. And in fact, well, I won't say more than that. You need to read the book to figure out what happened. But then, of course, there was, towards the end of the book, there were a number of, again, wives who helped. And all these meetings early on, the wives were central parts because they believed, and they were right, that the way you get these Nazis talking is they invited them to their home. Imagine inviting these people into your home, giving them dinner, and then serving enough alcohol that hopefully someone would loose lips. And around 1940, Leon Lewis gets one of his most important spies, a mother and daughter spy team. They had been the mother, it's Grace and Sylvia Comfort. Grace's husband had been a commander in the Navy and was a very close friend of the only government official who listened to Leon Lewis on a regular basis, Commander Ellis Zacharias, who was the head of naval intelligence for the Pacific Coast and happened to be a Jew and a graduate of Annapolis. He was the only government authority to respond to Lewis on a regular basis. They had told her, her husband had told her, you know, Zacharias, if you ever need something, go to Zacharias. And through Zacharias, they wound up going to Leon Lewis and working for Lewis from 1940 to the end, actually till around 44, when her life came under threat. Leon had already lost 3 of his spies, and he was unwilling to risk her being killed, and so she was sent to Washington, D.C.
I can tell you that Steve has studiously avoided most of the spoilers, which is great. So there's a lot still to read. We're going to open it up to questions, though, now. Anybody got any questions? Sir?
We have one request. Please make it, because we'd like to get as many of you to ask questions as possible, so make it a question, not an essay.
Sir.
You take the mic. Okay.
Two-part question based on my reading of the book. First, in practical terms, how did Leon Lewis create security for that 3-room office he had? Because clearly the Nazis and fascists knew where he was. That's part one. Part two is on the Consul General. It was implied in the book that because the gentleman who wrote the Nuremberg letter testified for him, he was a friend of his and he was Jewish. So maybe I'm reading more into the book about it, but the Consul General seemed to be very much not only not anti-Semitic, but perhaps even pro-Jewish.
I don't know if I would call him pro-Jewish, but I can tell you this. Once I discovered this letter and then talked to his daughter, everything fell into place for me because I realized, by the way, the Nazis wanted to get rid of him. They were right. I had a researcher in Berlin going through Gissling's personal file, and there were many letters there from the Bund complaining that he was insufficiently anti-Semitic and calling for him to be removed and replaced with a real National Socialist. But he never made an anti-Semitic statement. And I have a lot of his press statements where he denied. He said, oh, Germany was not treating the Jews as badly as the papers are saying. But he never made a single statement against the Jews. He hated the Bund. And again, he's a German nationalist. And his philosophy, his daughter told me at one point, she asked her father, what religion are we? We never go to church. You've gone to Amy Semple's seance, or you've gone to her, the Foursquare. You've gone to this and that, but you never go to any church or anything. What religion are we? And he said, imagine, he's saying this to his daughter in the 30s. He says, we have no religion. You will choose your own religion when you're a grown-up because you may wind up marrying a Muslim and converting to Islam. He was quite remarkable. And what was the second? There was no security. The only thing that happened is both the Klan, silver shirts, and the Nazis would post somebody across the street from his office, and they would stand there all day waiting to see if anyone they knew entered the building, because if anyone did, they knew he was one of Lewis's spies. But Lewis wasn't stupid. He never had anyone come to his home or to his office.
Thank you, Steve. Great book. Like to know about what you would recommend if we were to try to locate some of the locations, which ones are the most accessible and still exist. And also, I'd like to know if you know where Leon Lewis is buried. I'd like to lay some flowers
You know what?
someday.
I think he's buried in, I'm not sure. I have to check my records. I think he's buried in the VA, but I'm not sure here. In terms of these buildings, one of the things I'm thinking of doing as a fundraiser for the Kasdan is actually doing a walking tour that would be limited to 20, 25 people for a modest donation. I was interviewed by the New Yorker. I was in Talk of the Town last September, and I was telling Stephen, of all the things I've ever done, it's the thing that's most impressed my wife. She said, you've gotten into the New Yorker. I took Dana Goodyear, who's the New Yorker reporter on the West Coast, and did a tour of Nazi downtown, and also took her out to the Palisades where Hitler was building his Western, where Hitler supporters were building his Western White House. But if you take a look at the map, the key to the map in the book has addresses, and you can go. And I would say 3/4 of those buildings are still there. The few that aren't there is like the largest silver shirt post, Metropolitan Post 44, is now a Whole Foods, which has a very different flavor. Hold on just 1 second for the mic.
That's okay. Have you followed your research forward to the present day on both sides? And by that I mean, is there any residual organizations here in Los Angeles now that you see as descendants of that particular activity at the time, the fascist and neo-Nazi and Nazi activities? And also I'm curious because there is an official at the Writers Guild named Chuck Slocum, and is he related to your knowledge, or have you
No, to my
followed this
knowledge,
forward
he
at
didn't
all?
have any children. Any male children. He had a daughter who I talked to. The first part of the question now?
Have you followed the research
Oh.
forward?
The legacy, there's no spy group per se, at least not that I know of, but many of the human rights organizations
On the other side, on the neo-Nazi.
on the neo-Nazi side, I just know, Orange County has been a center for hate groups for years. Even before this was going on, you had a lot of hate groups. The Klan in Long Beach was tremendously powerful. When I moved here in 1979, the Klan was still very powerful. And my guess is there's still a Klan that has some power in Orange, San Diego counties, but nowhere near what they once were. And I don't think the hate groups, in other words, we can't, yes, what we've seen is these hate groups who have always been with us have come out of the woodwork more recently, but they aren't as many or as powerful as they were in the 1930s and early 40s.
Old enough to have lived in Los Angeles in the 30s. My parents were very active in B'nai B'rith. B'nai B'rith Messenger, the newspaper of the day, was a must-read. What did the media on the Jewish side, if anything, do about this issue that you so brilliantly discussed?
Well, for one thing, the columnists hated Gissling. And one of the columnists, Tomid, I forget his first name, which it was a pen name, talked about, there are a few Jews that I've met who said George Gissling isn't quite what he seemed and wasn't so bad. And they're fools. Gissling is a Nazi. They denounced all the Nazis in L.A. They called on the Roosevelt government and the local government to do more. But that's about all they did. I read the B'nai B'rith Messenger for all the years. I read the complete run. And they were giving a lot of coverage. And that's why when people say, Americans, we said Germans claim they didn't know what was going on, and Americans claim they didn't know what was going on. And here's what I would tell you. If you read the back of the trade press, that is New York Times, LA Times, the back pages, you could figure out what was going on. And the B'nai B'rith Messenger was doing it up front, trying to tell Angelenos what was going on. So any American who really wanted to know what was happening in Germany could figure out what was happening in Germany.
Gentleman
Thank you. I had the opportunity to read the book, which is a phenomenal book, and also visit all the sites that are on the map and take pictures of them. But I was struck as I went to each of these locations that, and maybe it's something to be done, there are no markers and no point of history on any of them that I could find, either inside or on the outside, including the theater down the street. And I think it might be, from an educational standpoint, worthwhile.
I don't know who's going to put those markers on there. I guess I could write Eric Garcetti.
I'll tell you what we're going to do. The USD Shoah Foundation has something called an iWalk app. And we're going to make an iWalk of this if he lets us. You mark them all digitally. Use your microphone. USC Shoah Foundation has something called an iWalk app, where you can do historical tours in Poland, Hungary, wherever, where people go. We could do an iWalk with our professor, and then we can mark them digitally. And then wherever you are, you can go and find the history. It'll all be there. The lady at the back, right there. Keep just on the back wall. There we go.
I have heard numerous times that if ever another Holocaust happened, it would be in America. Would you believe that?
No.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you both. And my question is, how are we supposed to feel about all of this? Because, you know, I'm going to buy the book for my father, and in hearing your lecture, I feel like someone who's 100 years old who was told by a doctor, guess what, at 30, you actually had, pancreatic cancer and almost died, but you didn't. You know, it's this kind of feeling of, are we supposed to feel comforted, disturbed? And how did you feel in writing all of this, because you were immersed in it? And forgive me for asking you how I'm supposed to feel, but I actually don't know. How the hell are we supposed to feel?
I think more than how are we supposed to feel, what are we supposed to do? That to me is the question. How did I feel? I was scared. But also, I had my eyes opened, because I went into this book, and I write in the prologue, as a kid, you know, I had a very typical survivor's child experience where my parents never talked about it, which made it far worse. And I can tell you, I don't know how many of you here had this experience, but my parents, almost all their friends, except for my mother's closest friend was American, they were all survivors. So I lived in Queens in a shtetl with survivors, so that when we would have Pesach, my sister and I were the ones with the accents at the table. And I remember it was not until I think it was it NBC that did the Holocaust? Yes. It wasn't until that, which was 78, 77, 78, that I remember sitting at the table, and one of my parents said, you know what? If American network television can talk about the Holocaust, then we can start talking about it. And that was the first time they and their friends would begin talking about it a little bit. My father never did. My mother would tell me bits and pieces, but I never got the full story. So it was scarier than getting the full story. And I swore as a kid that if I had been old enough, I would have gone and fought. And why didn't more Jews protest? Why didn't more Jews do more? And here's what I will tell you. In the course of the research, I've realized that I and generations of historians have been asking the wrong question, folks. Jews did more. The question is, why didn't American government officials from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. do more? They were spending all their efforts monitoring Reds who never threatened us in the way Nazis were threatening us. And so when people say, what's the lesson for today? To my mind, I'm not telling any of you to go out and start spying on any of these groups. And again, it's a dangerous thing. 3 of his operatives died. I'm not going to say which 3 or how, but 3 die. But there is one thing we can do, and that is whenever you hear hate speech, you hear somebody doing hate speech, say something. And somebody said to me, that's very dangerous. You know, have you ever tried? Yeah, say something, because here's what, if you actually say something, Or if you hear somebody doing hate speech and somebody says something to them and they give them back lip, you open your mouth and say, no, they're right, you shut up. We don't hate in America. And the one thing I will say, people have also asked, did the veterans who worked for Lewis, because just about every single one of them was a Christian, did they feel they were working for the Jews? And the answer is no. They knew they were working with a Jew, but they were working for America, because what they felt is here was a foreign group that hated Jewish Americans, that hated Catholic Americans, that hated black Americans. And what every one of these undercover operatives and their wives knew was that everything that appeared before the hyphen was an adjective, and that the only thing that mattered is that we're all Americans.
Until your book, my impression of Los Angeles and Nazi Germany during the 30s was Los Angeles as a welcoming place of refuge for Germans, Thomas Mann, Bertolt Brecht, Arnold Schoenberg. It's a very different story than the story that you're telling in your book. And I wondered how these two worlds, these two differing stories of the reaction of Los Angeles to Germany and Nazism during the 30s and early 40s, how they intersected, how these groups that you talked about dealt with the wave of German refugees from Nazism that came to Los Angeles in the 1930s.
The answer is they didn't intersect. Most of the famous emigres we know moved out to the Palisades, and they stayed amongst themselves. And people like Thomas Mann were still writing, and they were doing editorials in newspapers in Germany denouncing Hitler. But none of them got involved with Leon Lewis or the operation. They also didn't get involved with the Jewish community in LA. They very much stayed in a German-Austrian center in the Palisades. And so there wasn't much interaction at all. But you also had a lot of movie industry people who fled from Germany to Austria, and they got involved with the studios, and they found jobs in the studios. But again, they found America a welcome respite, but they were not involved actively in this or in the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League.
So in the book, there's one little paragraph about the place in the Palisades that where the Nazi sympathizers lived, and it's still there. And why hasn't it been destroyed or taken away? Parts of it, a lot of it is still there. And who owns that property now?
I believe the property is owned by either the city or the county, and I hope they don't. I've heard for years they talk about that they're going to tear it down. They put a fence around it, and then everyone just cut through the fence. In case you don't know what we're talking about, somewhere around 1933, 34, 35, this couple, the Stevens, who were very wealthy, both of them were millionaires, husband and wife on their own. They came under the influence of a mysterious man known only as Herr Schmidt. And Herr Schmidt was a Svengali-like character who believed he could read the future. And I'm wondering, he may not have been so wrong, because he said, this is 33, 34, that Hitler will eventually start a war in Europe. He will conquer all of Europe, and then he will turn his sights on the United States, and Japan will join in with him. And between the two of them, they will conquer the United States as well. And then we are going to build for Hitler, we being the Stevens, what I call the Western White House, but it was going to be his command center for the United States. It's in the Palisades. If you go up Capri and head north until you dead end on the fire road, park your car, and then walk in along the fire road heading northwest, take the first set of stairs down, and then follow the road, and you're going to come across some abandoned buildings and some abandoned parts of buildings. What it was going to be was a 22-bedroom compound with its own meat locker, its own water supply, its own electrical supply, its own vegetable garden, an electric fence that was going to surround the entire property. And this is where Hitler, remember, LA is roughly halfway between Berlin and Tokyo. So this is where Hitler would come and where he would have his generals who would be command central in the United States. The irony for this is they had some initial blueprints drawn up, and then they brought it to one of the most prominent architects in Los Angeles, who drew up a second series of plans that are at UCLA. And for those of you who know the names of architects, he was Paul Williams. And for those of you who don't know the name, and you why is everyone laughing? Paul Williams is an African-American architect. And I can't believe he knew what and who he was doing this for.
In summation, you dug through all these boxes of archives, you pieced the history together, you told the story. As you stand back now and look at this, what was Leon Lewis's contribution to history?
Well, I think the most important one is he makes us reconsider the nature of Jewish resistance in the 30s and 40s. And for people who think about Jews as being anything other than muscular, brave, or courageous, of not being willing to risk their lives, Leon Lewis is a major corrective to all that. Because not only did Leon Lewis start the spy operation here, but Leon Lewis went to New York to encourage New Yorkers to do it. He went back to Chicago. New Yorkers, they said, no, HUAC is going to take care of that. Just remember, the first House Un-American Activities Committee that started in 1934 was launched by Samuel Dickstein, Jewish congressman from the Lower East Side. And he launched it to investigate Nazis and fascists. And then they threw in communists at the end. And he said, I don't want to be the chairman of this group, because if I'm the chairman, every American's going to think it's just Jewish paranoia. So they gave it to a good Irish Catholic from Boston who subverted it and turned it into an anti-communist investigation, so that roughly 3/4 of all investigation were communists and only 1/4 were Nazis and fascists. And so Lewis encouraged spy operations in Chicago, in the Midwest, in San Francisco, and I don't know how many of those records have survived. You know, I've been trying to look around for some of them. But Leon Lewis both, by the way, there was no sabotage, successful sabotage in Los Angeles while Leon Lewis was on watch, whereas there were multiple bombings along the East Coast in New Jersey and Pennsylvania and New York, that when Leon Lewis's spy, Neil Ness, his other ace spy, testified before HUAC in 1939 and talked about how he had been part of the Nazi plot that was going to blow up the Hercules powder plant. The Hercules powder plant was blown up in early 41, only it was the Hercules powder plant in Pennsylvania, not the one in California. And had he not alerted the authorities, I'm convinced there would have been sabotage in military installations and in aircraft factories all throughout LA County.
And can we expect a movie?
Well, I am very pleased to say, actually, not many historians can say I actually have an agent, an ICM, a big agent. And we are in the, literally down to the last 3 items, negotiating. I'm working with a producer. I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to jinx it. But he's won an Oscar. He's had major motion pictures. And I actually don't want this as a movie. I told Stephen I want it as a limited series on a Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, because there are so many stories that 2 hours isn't going to cover all of this. We need much more than that.
Steve Ross, thank you for your amazing contribution, and thank you for a wonderful book. Thank you.
Before we adjourn, I would just like Lou Groner to come up a minute and thank Lou for what he's done for us.
Wow, that was incredible. Just fabulous. Thank you so, so much. Another round of applause. Thank God for Leon Lewis, that's for sure. I want to thank everybody for coming today. It's a terrific crowd, and based on your questions, obviously a very engaged crowd. You gave up a beautiful Sunday afternoon to be here, so we're most appreciative of that. I just want to take 60 seconds to explain why the Jewish Community Foundation has funded this presentation and has been an ongoing funder of the Kasdan Institute, and just shed a little bit more light on us. I look around the room, there's some of you who we know and are very familiar with us, and there are others who probably have no idea what the Jewish Community Foundation is all about. So let me share with you the headline from one of our ad campaigns from some years ago that really captures the essence of what we're all about. And it goes like this: if you think earning money is hard, try giving it away. Think about it. If you think earning money is hard, try giving it away. Deciding which causes to support, how best to support them, and how to ensure that they're accomplishing what your funding is intended to do can sometimes be a rather cumbersome, confusing, and complicated endeavor. In the case of the Kasdan Institute, however, it's a very easy decision for us at the Jewish Community Foundation to support their vital programs. They have a stellar reputation in the community, and among other things, they host terrific and amazing lectures like this one that significantly impacts a wide swath of the greater LA community. But many people just aren't aware of which causes are the most appropriate ones that meet their charitable objectives. And that's where the Los Angeles Jewish Community Foundation comes in. We help many of our 1,300 donor families give more strategically, give more effectively, and give with more confidence, based on our 65 years of experience and the extensive expertise of our staff in the nonprofit space. We also guide many of our donors on working to engage their children and grandchildren more actively in their family's philanthropy or in some kind of tzedakah that resonates with them. So, if you'd like to learn a little bit more about the Jewish Community Foundation and the grant making we do in the community, and perhaps how your charitable endeavors may be strengthened by partnering with us, we'd be delighted to speak with you at the conclusion, which is pretty much now. There's a number of us here, and again, we'd be honored to speak with you. On behalf of everyone at the Jewish Community Foundation, I just want to wish everyone here a very happy, healthy, and very tasty Passover holiday. For those of you who may be of different faiths, I want to wish everyone a very happy Easter holiday. Thank you so much.
And one last word before you leave today. We would love to invite you to a reception. If you go out of the room here and you make a left, we have some food. I want to thank Stephen Smith for being in conversation. And finally, if you are willing to buy a book, I will sit there and I will sign the book to anyone you want. Thank you all for coming today, and I hope we'll see you at more Kasdan events.